Thank you for having me here. I'd like to thank Eduardo for everything that he's done to put this together, and I'm very pleased to have been asked to speak. It's been some time since I've written on Thoreau, and I was glad to have a chance to come back to him and to try to write on him again. But what I've produced is something that is new and something that I'm still thinking through. You could say that what I've written is intended to be a provocation to push readers of Walden back to the book, to get them to think about it a bit more or again. But it's also a provocation to myself. In many ways, this paper is an attempt to obey that saying of St. Augustine's that you should believe in order to understand. And so I'm going to tell you some things that I think I believe, but that I'm not sure I understand about Thoreau. That's a dangerous practice in a setting like this, I know, but I wanted to come and offer you something fresh, even if it was something that was perhaps not really fully cooked. So we'll see how this goes. So the title of the paper is Here I Am, Thoreau on Economy and Experience. Introduction. In this essay, I want to locate Thoreau, to place him, if you will. I fear that Walden is one of the worst read books that I can call to mind. There are all sorts of reasons that the book is so badly read, and I will not now try to catalog them. But among the most important of them is the fact that the book is often, even typically, read by readers who are simply not yet ready for it, not ready for it existentially. Cleverness, candle power alone is not enough. It takes a long time to become old enough to read Walden. I'm still a little young for it, I worry. Anyway, it is not a book for the callow. Only a person of a certain maturity, of a certain experience, is ready to front its pages. Recall Aristotle's warning at the threshold of Nicomachean Ethics, the warning that a young person is not a fit person to attend the lectures, quote, because he's not versed in the practical business of life, unquote. The business that provides the book's subject matter. There should be a similar warning across the threshold of Walden. And perhaps there is in its epigraph. The book is intended to wake up Thoreau's neighbors. But the young are not yet old enough to have fallen into the sleep that Thoreau wars against, the sleep of reason, a kind of existential enshadowment that can befall only those who have spent part of their lives abroad, out and about, those old enough to be called citizens of Concord. This does not mean that the young are awake in the crucial Thoreauvian sense. It means instead that they are neither asleep nor awake, but are in a limbo of consciousness, of conscience. I admit that Thoreau himself bears part of the responsibility for the bad reading of Walden. For example, he talks of his proper audience as poor students. But deliberate reading of the text reveals that he's not talking about those who are of the age of students, but about those who've retained a certain plasticity of mind and character, who are still such as to be stirred to action by the call to betterment, by the call to elevate their lives by conscious endeavor. The poverty Thoreau has first in mind is akin to the poverty spoken of in the Sermon on the Mount. Poverty of spirit, a humble receptivity, a willingness not just to hear someone talk about changing, but to actually attempting to change. Now, since I've mentioned Aristotle, and he will make an appearance a few more times in these pages, let me station here at the beginning of the essay the other great warning from the early pages of Nicomachean Ethics about the kind of study it is. Quote, since the branch of philosophy on which we are at present engaged is not, like the others, theoretical in its aim, because we are studying not to know what goodness is, but to become good men, since otherwise it would be useless, we must apply our minds to the problem of how our actions should be performed, because it is these that actually determine our dispositions, unquote. Although I do not take Thoreau's distinction between the theoretical and the practical simply to mirror Aristotle's, I do take these words seriously as a warning about the kind of study Walden is. You read it not to learn what economy is, but to become economical, since otherwise it will be useless, nothing more than empty crowing, a rooster's roiling rattle, One more warning from Aristotle seems appropriate just to drive the point home. Quote, again from the Nicomachean Ethics, most people have recourse to theory and imagine that they are being philosophical and that in this way they will become serious-minded, behaving rather like invalids who listen carefully to their doctor but carry out none of his instructions. Just as the bodies of the latter will get no benefit from such treatment, so the souls of the former will get none from such philosophy. Unquote. But most readers of Walden have recourse to theory. They theorize the book and thus denature it. The writer of Walden is an economist of the human person. He diagnoses our illness, the disorder in our households, the reasons we are unhoused. He highlights the causes of our darkest sufferings. His pages advise. We must either submit to these pages, perhaps in an experimental way, but still we must submit to them, or we will simply miss the book altogether. If we theorize Walden, we grasp its husk, but at the cost of its fruitfulness, we claim its form, but deny its power. Although I will not take this thought far now, my use of the word power reminds me to offer the following reminder. Thoreau's book is one of many in the history of philosophy that belong to De Quincey's literature of power rather than his literature of knowledge. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is perhaps the first work of philosophy to draw explicit attention to the fact that it belongs to a literature other than the literature of knowledge. But surely Aristotle's teacher, Plato, and Plato's teacher, Socrates, had a firm hold on some such distinction too, and were involved in doing something, whether that be the writing of dialogues or the having of them, that could not be confined to the literature of knowledge. Consider the closing of the Theaetetus, in which Socrates explains to Theaetetus that the aporia into which they have fallen, while perhaps sad enough if the conversation belongs wholly to the literature of knowledge, should, as a matter of fact, be viewed as a signal source of power to Theaetetus as he goes on in his life. But too often our default response to this distinction, or to ones akin to it, is to take it as marking not a division within philosophy, but between philosophy and non-philosophy. And so works like Aristotle's or Thoreau's can only be rehoused in philosophy by means of recategorization. And then, unfortunately, we lose the work itself. We retain what we might call its verbal twin, but that twin is not identical to the work itself. Too often, we quietly assume that practical philosophy is just a kind of theoretical philosophy, say theory about practice. But this is no more true than it's true that a verb is a kind of noun, say a noun that names an action. The distinction between a verb and a noun is one of the biggest distinctions there is. So too the distinction between the theoretical and the practical. Philosophy is not exhausted by theory, at least not in the logical sense of exhausted, but it's exhausted by it often enough in another and more familiar sense. In what follows, I'm going to wind through two topics at the center of Walden, economy and experience. I cannot cleanly separate the topics. Understanding each involves understanding the other. But economy comes first in the book, and so I will take it up first. I will then turn to experience. I admit now, before we get started, that what I'm offering is a still developing way of thinking about Thoreau, one that I have not mastered myself, if indeed it works and can be mastered. My own method aims to instantiate and not merely describe what I take to be the method of Walden. So the second section on economy, and the first part of the second section is economy and conceptual appreciation. Thoreau writes economy instead of philosophy, just as Wittgenstein early wrote logic instead of philosophy, and later wrote grammar instead of philosophy. Let us concentrate for a moment on Wittgenstein's later substitution. Wittgenstein lengthened the reach of grammar when he substituted it for philosophy, but he wasn't simply changing one word into a synonym of the other, like a code. When I say pineapple, I really mean extreme emergency. No, grammar lengthens its reach so that it is no longer strictly synonymous with its use in handbooks of grammar or in elementary school classes, but it also has not become ambiguous or vague. Call it rather elastic or elasticized, stretched. Wittgensteinian grammar recognizes differences among kinds of words, parts of speech, but it's rife with them and does not fix their number at 8, or if it does, it recognizes that there are varieties unexpected in each of the parts. Wittgensteinian grammar treats the differences among parts of speech as the biggest differences there are, and not as subtle differences best left to funereal grammarians, to those who, before speaking, will learn how to speak, and who thus die in, if not of, silence. Thoreau does something similar with economy. He does not simply substitute the word for the word philosophy, but rather he stretches the term and then uses the stretched term instead of philosophy. Economy, as Thoreau uses it, is radical, attached firmly to its Greek roots and to the sense that it had for Aristotle or the student of Aristotle who wrote the Economics. Thoreau's intent is to distance philosophy as he understands and practices it from philosophy as it's understood and professed. Thoreau wants to make philosophy more sober, primarily in the sense of sober used by Kierkegaard, in which sobriety increases as the distance between what is believed and what is lived decreases. But secondarily, Thoreau wants to make philosophy more sober in the sense of sober used by J.L. Austin when he dreamt the motto of a sober philosophy, neither a be-all nor an end-all be. A sober philosophy, an economics of Thoreau's sort, will minimize the distance between the existential or lived appearance and reality. It will renounce its ambitions to say everything, or at least to have the last word. Of course, sober is not really a word in Thoreau's lexicon, but I suggest that it is what he has in mind when he notes that what he requires from each person is a simple and sincere account of his or her life. Simple here is not to be taken as the antonym of complex. What account of a life is more complex than Walden? But rather as the antonym of jumbled. Sincere means wholehearted and heartfelt, free of hypocrisy, full of candor. Sober. Such an economics will be in the business of delivering home truths, actionable intelligence. As a work of Thoreauvian economics, Walden takes the form of a mixture of indirect and direct spiritual exercise. Indirect in that it is an account, a sober account of Thoreau's own life, in which he functions as an object of comparison for the reader. Direct in that Thoreau often stops telling the reader about his own exercises and just addresses the reader. But I classify Walden not only as a spiritual exercise, but also as a work of conceptual appreciation. That term is not familiar, I realize. I take it from Paul Ziff, who, so far as I can tell, is no longer much read in contemporary philosophy. Ziff subtitled his book, Philosophical Turnings, Essays in Conceptual Appreciation. Ziff doesn't spend much time explaining his subtitle. He trusts the essays to exemplify what he has in mind. I will not take the time now to attempt an exact description of Ziff's method. Suffice it to say that his method is a congener to what Wittgenstein called conceptual investigation, or to an important part of that method. For instance, consider this passage from G.E. Moore's description of Wittgenstein's lectures. Quote, "Reasons," Wittgenstein said, "in aesthetics are of the nature of further descriptions. That is, you can make a person see what Brahms was driving at by showing him lots of different pieces by Brahms, or by comparing him with a contemporary author, and all that aesthetics does is draw your attention to a thing, to place things side by side," unquote. I believe this centers Wittgenstein's method, and that it also centers Ziff's method of conceptual appreciation. Concepts, like works of art, can be displayed, shown, and key to such showing is the right sort of drawing attention to the concept, or placing the concept in the right place in the right set of other, in some sense, alternative concepts. Thoreau has no interest in compelling his reader into agreement. What he wants is conversion, not conclusion. So he describes ways of living, chiefly his own and that of his Concordian neighbors. He draws attention to them in a certain sort of way, places them side by side. He helps us to see that the concept or concepts such ways of living instantiate. He is not suggesting that there are no other alternatives to pawn off on us an existential false dilemma, as if there were one conceivable amalgam, the good life for human beings, and one of the two ways of living was that amalgam, namely his own. There are disparate ideals present in human life, more than anyone has world enough or time to chase, much less realize, and we need to have the grace to be torn between them, or perhaps to chase, sometimes to realize a compromise between or among them. We are not forced to choose simply, between being a Concord Martha and a Walden Mary. But bringing us to acknowledge that there is a choice invites us to recognize that busyness with many things does often blind us to other things that are necessary, to the necessaries. Perhaps most often it coaxes us into forgetting that the quality of our living is in large part determined not only by our securing the things that are necessary, but by how we secure them. Sadly, we often secure the necessaries of life in deathly fashion. Profit and loss accrue to our methods, not just to what the methods secure. Better a dry morsel and quietness therewith than a house full of sacrifices with strife. Some things we treat as necessary are such that we cannot have them without loss, because there's no method for securing them that does not plunge us into the red. What Thoreau wants us to see is that those things that really are necessary, we can typically secure without reddening ourselves. For Thoreau, there is a largesse in nature. What we really need from it is almost ours for the asking. Knock and answer, seek and find. But we do have to knock, seek, ask, entreat, pray. We have to trust a good deal more than we do. We are to live in simplicity, independence, magnanimity, and trust. And that last word is like love. At the end of faith, hope, and love, the greatest of these is trust. And we are to solve some of the problems of life, not only theoretically, but practically. Thoreau's phrasing here is tricky. It almost always is, of course. I don't take him to enjoin upon us the theoretical and practical solution to some of the problems of life. Instead, I take him to insinuate that any purely theoretical solution to such a problem is not a genuine solution. We have to live lives not just in which there are subtle thoughts, but in which our living is itself dictated by the wisdom we love. Otherwise, we are unfaithful lovers, willing to say in letters what we will not say in ears. We are hearers of words, but not doers of them. Thoreau has less patience than St. James or Kierkegaard for love without the works of love. The problems of life are practical problems, at least primarily, even though we try to sublime them into purely theoretical problems. Take as an example the problem of other minds. In many of its determinate forms, isn't it an attempt to refine our own hard-heartedness or indifference into a problem for reflection? Isn't it a way of pardoning our fear of acknowledgement by congratulating ourselves on our epistemic high-mindedness? The theoretical problem functions as a distracting sideshow, hiding our own personal failures, our sclerosis of heart, and our inattention, and aggrandizing them into properly heated pangs of epistemic conscience. Now, my point here isn't reductive. I'm not claiming that all problems of life simply reduce to practical problems, that there really are no theoretical problems of life. Rather, my point, and I take it Thoreau's, is that more often than not, the problems of life are practical problems, and that solving them doesn't wait on the solution to an associated theoretical problem, if there is one. In fact, the relationship between the practical problem and an associated theoretical problem reverses the expected direction. Often the apparent insolubility of an associated theoretical problem results from our failure to address or rightly to address the practical problem. My fear that I cannot know the other, or my fear of being known by the other, itself widens the theoretical gulf I take to be fixed between myself and the other. My fear widens the gulf between my premises and my conclusion, between what I take to be available to myself or to others and what I take to be secreted or to be my secret. It turns out that the old conundrum of whether the skeptic can live her skepticism is itself shadowed by a larger and darker conundrum, namely whether the skeptic can stop living her skepticism for long enough to find her way past it, out of it, or over it. Thoreau's philosophy, his economy, is necessary not because we cannot live our skepticism, but because we can and do. Freeing myself from my lived skepticism is more a matter of enlarging or limbering my character and of softening my heart, and less a matter of acquiring information or knowledge. No amount of theory can simulate real commitment or resolution. Thoreau's term for lived skepticism is, of course, quiet despair. Thoreau writes to combat that quiet despair, a despair so quiet it slips by us like a field mouse, never disturbing the grass, but leaving behind empty days and empty nights. Thoreau arrays lives unconsumed by quiet despair alongside those that are, and reminds us that we may choose, have chosen. Must my life instantiate quiet despair? Must I live unhoused and unhappy, slowly shiftless and drowsily peregrine? Or can I live past that despair, live a life filled with rightly secured necessities, a life housed and happy? What keeps me attached to this quiet despair? What makes me think that it's the life I should live? The next section here is doubling up and doubling down. I've long been exercised by a passage in Walden, one of whose meaning I remain unsure, but I'm sure that the passage bears on the issues of quiet despair and of Thoreau's method of conceptual appreciation, and ultimately on his notion of experience. Let me remind you of this passage. Quote, "With thinking we may be beside ourselves in a sane sense. By a conscious effort of the mind, we can stand aloof from actions and their consequences, and all things, good and bad, go by us like a torrent. We are not wholly involved in nature. I may be either the driftwood in the stream or Indra in the sky looking down on it. I may be affected by a theatrical exhibition. On the other hand, I may not be affected by an actual event which appears to concern me much more. I only know myself as a human entity, the scene, so to speak, of thoughts and affections, and am sensible of a certain doubleness by which I can stand as remote from myself as from another. However intense my experience, I'm conscious of the presence and criticism of a part of me, which, as it were, is not a part of me but spectator, sharing no experience but taking note of it, and that is no more I than it is you. When the play, it may be the tragedy, of life is over, the spectator goes his way. It was a kind of fiction, a work of imagination only, so far as he was concerned. This doubleness may easily make us poor neighbors and friends sometimes." Unquote. This doubleness in us that Thoreau puts his finger on has, to borrow a phrase of Emerson's, two handles. It can be taken up in a positive or a negative way. The positive way is a taking up that recognizes the doubleness in us, our amphibian life, and recognizes that it's internal to what it is to be human. This positive way allows us to resituate ourselves in space and time, indeed to resituate ourselves in relation to ourselves. It is our reflection, this doubleness, and as long as it remains ours, it's an altered mode of absorption within our circumstances. Richard Gottschalk captures the positive way like this. So it's a quotation from Gottschalk. Quote, "The philosopher's aim is the universal and eternal. These, however, are, and are reflectively discernible, only in and through the individual and temporal. Or better, since the universal and individual, eternal and temporal, are not distinct things or opposites, but constitute reflectively characterizable aspects of the concrete situation of being, reflection must break forth out of non-reflective immersion in the present actual situation. In so doing, it does not leave that situation, but constitutes that altered mode of absorption within the concrete situation, which attempts to elicit in conception the universal and eternal accessible to it." Unquote. Now, this is a point that goes deep in Walden, I think, to its bottom, we might say. Our access to what is universal and eternal is through what's individual and temporal, but with the all-important qualification that we do not think of the two doublets, individual universal and temporal eternal, as distinct from one another in the wrong way, say as platonically distinct, and also not as opposites. To think of them as opposites, itself a distinct way of thinking of them as distinct things, is a disaster, since we face the problem of distributing reality, as it were, across the opposites, and that puts us in a metaphysical mess. Either one side or the other is the real one, and the other unreal, except, well, of course, not exactly unreal, because it is in some way or another, it almost is, as if existence were a game like horseshoes where close could count. Plato called closeness participation, I guess. One crucial part of the business of the philosopher and of the Thoreauvian economist is to distinguish among distinctions. The distinction between individual universal and temporal eternal are not distinctions between opposites. Not all contrasts are contrasts between opposites. Gottschalk takes the universal and eternal to be reflectively characterizable aspects of the concrete situation of being, as revealed by an altered mode of immersion in the concrete situation. Discerning the universal and eternal requires not that I abandon my immersion in the concrete situation, but that I alter my mode of immersion in it. Moving from the individual and temporal to the universal and eternal does not demand a metaphysical relocation, Plotinus's flight of the alone to the alone, say, but rather demands a reorientation, a new mode of hearkening, a new kind of receptivity. I don't have to travel. I do not emerge from immersion, but change my mode of absorption in the situation even as I remained immersed. I become, as I would like to put it, and here I go beyond anything Gottschalk explicitly says, more deeply immersed. The universal and eternal are to be found not in abstraction from the individual and temporal things around us, but in a more aware, more committed, deeper and ever deeper absorption in them. Think of this deepening mode of immersion as moving me from glory to glory. The point of this deepened immersion for Thoreau is empowerment, increased scope and depth and resource. Because thus immersed, I am not thus relocated. My immersion does not shrink or stiffen my practical presence in the world, but at least eventually enlarges and limbers it. I become more fully responsive to the concrete situation, less abstracted or distracted, more attentive. In fact, in this altered mode of immersion, I realize that it is my diurnal mode of immersion that's often itself abstracted or distracted, inattentive, sleepy. Things present themselves to me in a weary round of always the same, always goddamn sameness, and I slide and flicker among things, barely making contact. But I don't want to get lost in this part of my point. What I'm trying to do is to characterize a positive form of doubleness, a doubleness of modes of absorption, one that's worth cultivating, even if it can come at a cost to us, can sometimes make us poor neighbors and friends. Now, I think of this as Thoreau's way of counting the cost that echoes a passage in Emerson, right, where Emerson writes, I shun the father and mother and wife and brother when my genius calls me. Now, I take Thoreau to be cautioning us about going too far with this doubleness. We cannot do away with it except by deadening ourselves, denying what we are. And in fact, we surely should cultivate it, but carefully, circumspectly, attempting to find the right amount of it in a life that, to be all that it should be, needs neighbors and friends. That we are double is no excuse for never being fully present or for choosing doubleness at the wrong moment. Now, the negative way of understanding this doubleness is something that Gottschalk helps with too. So one more quick quotation from him. Quote, philosophy, in seeking the universal and eternal, seeks what underlies and permeates itself. That is, it's a seeking for being from within being. Man within being is agent, and his thought, if it's to reflect his situation as agent and to elucidate his being and that of other beings in the world, must involve the presence of and remain true to the sense of being belonging to a being in being. Man cannot get outside of his condition to look at it any more than he can get outside being to look at it. Nor will looking at others allow elucidation of them in their being, for looking at involves, among other things, a presumption of detachment at variance with the manner in which beings exist universally. Beings exist universally. Thus, the manner in which beings I look at are essentially united with me in my being. Unquote. The negative way of taking up this doubleness is to take it as if it allowed us to escape from our concrete conditions, to metaphysically relocate, to look at being. So you can see I'm struggling here with Thoreau's talk of spectators. There's a presentment of McDowell here, not only in the Gottschalk, but also in his terminology. Look at from the outside is, of course, very much like McDowell's view from sideways on. So while the doubleness Thoreau speaks of, in its positive sense, may make us sometimes poor neighbors and friends, it leaves us among our neighbors and friends, and leaves us with the sense of being belonging to a being in being and among other beings. We remain united and acknowledge that union. I can alter my mode of absorption in being, but cannot stop being absorbed in being. I'm an agent among other agents and agencies. I can find my way to an absorption in my own agency, in other agents or other agencies that will allow me to find the universal and eternal, but I cannot become Schopenhauer's winged cherub or Plato's all-spectator, and in so doing find a new world of beings to be among. Taking it that way not only makes me have to figure out how to distribute reality across the worlds, but it also makes me have to figure out how to distribute value across them. One of the dangers of this multiplication of worlds is that it invites us to think that our world, that is, this world, We'll eventually yield to our compulsion toward total explication, that we can find a coign of vantage from which the opacities and densities of this world can be rendered transparent and thin. And of course, that never need arise for the other world, not this but the true world, because it's hypostasized as fully intelligible, free of opacities, densities. Consider Plato's forms, fully transparent, gossamer, lit from within and free of all shadows, even a shadow of turning. Eventually, the mysteries of our relations to ourselves and to others and to the world, that is, this world, will be done away with, and we will know it as we know the other true world. Or if that proves impossible, we'll abandon it for the other world, leave it darkly in the dark, unreal, or valueless. Better to take Thoreau's cautionary advice, one world at a time. The fine American writer, Marilyn Robinson, was once asked if she'd had a religious awakening. She answered, quote, "No, a mystical experience would be wasted on me. Ordinary things have always seemed numinous to me. One Calvinist notion deeply implanted in me is that there are two sides to your encounter with the world. You don't simply perceive something that's statically present, but in fact there's a visionary quality to all experience. It means something because it's addressed to you. This is the individualism that you find in Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. You can draw from perception the same way a mystic would draw from a vision." Unquote. This Calvinist notion is certainly one that permeates Walden, and it's no surprise that Robinson finds it also in the pages of Whitman and Dickinson. The numinousness of the ordinary is what the altered mode of immersion shows to us, and we can draw guidance from that immersion, from that immersed perception, in the way mystics have drawn guidance from vision. So, last section in this part, unforced choices. Let me underline a crucial feature of Thoreau's conceptual appreciation. It's a form of cortesia. A delicate tact characterizes it throughout. And this remains true even in the midst of all of Thoreau's crowing. Thoreau so respects his reader that he gives his reader room, gives his reader space. A penumbra drapes all otherness, and that penumbra is the freedom of the other. Thoreau writes recognizing and summoning the freedom of his reader as he lives recognizing and summoning his own. Walden is a penumbral work. Its method internalizes a certain reserve, a certain reticence. Thoreau hopes for a similar delicate tact from his reader. So here's a quotation from Walden. "You'll pardon some obscurities, for there are more secrets in my trade than in most men's, and yet not voluntarily kept, but inseparable from its very nature. I would gladly tell all that I know about it, and never paint no admittance on my gate." Unquote. Thoreau's method involves secrets. There are things he cannot tell, but that's not because he's keeping secrets. Rather, the secrets belong to the method itself. In part, this is because the method is itself a form of indirection. Thoreau does not give a simple and sincere account of himself. Thoreau does give a simple and sincere account of himself. He presents himself, says, "Here I am." But as he points out, that means that his account is a letter from a distant land, a kind of exile's letter, such as all accounts are. Thoreau speaks out his heart and mind without regret, but that does not mean that he can tell everything, or that we can, as it were, translate from his language into ours without loss or ambiguity. That is one reason for secrets. Another is that there's no end of things in the heart. Telling comes to an end someplace, always before all is told. We live past what we say or write. Thoreau knows this, he hopes for it, he wants us to live past what he has written. Now, I can make clearer what I mean by changing tack for a moment and taking up a couple of passages from Wittgenstein's Blue Book. This first passage reveals what's central to that work in the form of an aside, a parenthetical. Wittgenstein's been showing that various things we might take to be necessary to the understanding of an order are not necessary to it. And having shown that, he turns parenthetically to the reader. Quote, "Now, I don't say that this, understanding an order by making use of a mental image, is not possible. Only putting it this way immediately shows that it need not happen. This, by the way, illustrates the method of philosophy." Unquote. And later, Wittgenstein, again parenthetically, insists on sobriety in the use of this method when he underlines that, quote, "We easily forget how much a notation, a form of expression may mean to us, and that changing it isn't always as easy as it is in mathematics or in the sciences. A change of clothes or of names may mean very little, and it may mean a great deal." Unquote. Now, Wittgenstein here touches on a memorable topic in Walden, clothing. And Wittgenstein's point is one that I take Thoreau to agree to and to approach with care and candor, showing that a particular way of dressing or of living is not, after all, necessary, can sometimes cut to the quick. Making such changes is not by any means always a small thing, inconsequential. Ways of living may mean a great deal and very often do. Thoreau, even in telling us about our clothes, does not lose sight of the fact that for many the clothes they wear mean a great deal. They seem even to make the man or the woman. When he challenges our sartorial or existential dogmatism, Thoreau knows that what he's challenging us about may mean a great deal to us, may seem even to mean everything. Sartor Resartus, sure, but gently, gently. Thoreau wants you to worry about your clothes or your way of living, but he's not trying to force you into some ready-to-wear outfit that he's chosen for you. It may be that all you need to do, in fact, is to wear your old clothes in a new spirit, to wrap your old coat around your renewed heart, or it may be that you need to buy new clothes without buying the illusion that you've been reborn, without buying a distinction between your appearance and your reality. Thoreau works to free us of the notion that the lives we have are compulsory, that there's no choice but to have them. We do not have to eat, drink, dress, or work as we do. We do not have to house ourselves as we do. We read what Thoreau writes, and often it shows immediately that the lives we have need not be the lives we have. That Thoreau does not mean that changing them is easy, no more than it's easy to escape the fly bottle in Wittgenstein, even after we know it for what it is. The problem with the fly bottles that concern Thoreau is that they, like Wittgenstein's, entrap us by using us to trap ourselves. The exit from a fly bottle stands always open. We do not leave because we do not desire to leave, or because we refuse to leave except on our own terms. The problem is not some narrowness in the neck of the fly bottle, but our own stiff-neckedness. No one can escape a fly bottle for me. My captivity, sadly and happily, is my own. Sadly, because I cannot borrow another's escape plan, though of course I can be provoked or inspired by their plans, and happily, since the fly bottle is in some sense me, mine. I cannot be entrapped in a bottle cleverer, more twisty than I am, since the bottle can at most be as clever as I am. At any rate, no one other than me forces me to live this life. So here's another quotation from Wittgenstein, again from the Blue Book. In philosophy, one feels forced to look at a concept in a certain way. What I do is suggest, or even invent, other ways of looking at it. I suggest possibilities which you had not previously thought. You thought that there was one possibility, or only two at most, but I made you think of others. Furthermore, I made you see that it was absurd to expect the concept to conform to these narrow possibilities. Thus, your mental cramp is relieved, and you're free to look around the field of use of the expression and to describe the different kinds of uses of it. Unquote. Thoreau's economizing, his conceptual appreciation, aims to relieve our existential cramps, to allow us to be free to look around the field of use of a human life and to see the variety in the uses of it. Thoreau keeps inviting us to existential deliberation, but he doesn't dictate the conclusion of that deliberation. Thoreau floats like a bumblebee and stings like a butterfly. My apologies there to Muhammad Ali and to O.K. Balsma, for those of you who might know the transmission of that line. So, final section, experience. Thoreau's understanding of experience is radically non-reductive. He imposes no a priori constraints on what is and what is not available to experience. The world reveals itself. It reveals colors, sounds, textures, odors, tastes, as well as beings and values and obligations. And these are as fully perceptually disclosed as our colors and so on, although of course in different ways. We experience all sorts of things of each of many, many different kinds: seas and skies, forests and fields, trees and grasses, people and animals, values and obligations. Each of these finds its moment in experience. Thoreau refuses to whittle experience down, to emaciate experience, to depopulate it or void it of values. Thoreau will not reduce experience to the shown, shimmering sheen of the given. He refuses to bugbear himself with a certainty good only to entrap epistemologists in an outer darkness. And not only that, he refuses to conceive of his body and in particular of his senses, as biological devices for gathering information, as if my body, my eyes and ears and nose and tongue and hands were just so much spyware. Thoreau is a naturalist with no patience for naturalism, as that latter term is understood in contemporary philosophy. I want to unpack these pronouncements just a bit. Thoreau reacquaints us with our perceptual faith and its opacities. I'm borrowing that term from Merleau-Ponty. So, characterizing this perceptual faith, Merleau-Ponty writes, quote, "We see the things themselves. The world is what we see. Formula of this kind express a faith common to the natural man and the philosopher. The moment he opens his eyes, they refer to a deep-seated set of mute opinions implicated in our lives." And then Merleau-Ponty writes in the margin, "Notion of faith to be specified, it's not faith in the sense of decision, but in the sense of what is before any position, animal and faith." It's all, by the way, early in the visible and the invisible. Merleau-Ponty here provides a formula for something that Thoreau himself leaves unformulated but does not omit in Walden. Indeed, this faith underwrites all of Walden, underwrites each and every word, each and every blade of grass and fallen leaf. Thoreau does not seek to formulate the faith exactly. He has no quixotic interest in stating this mute opinion. No, he simply stands on this faith and calls us back to it again and again. He presents us with and presents us to the things themselves. Back to the things themselves is as fit a motto for Thoreau's economics as it is for phenomenology. Merleau-Ponty continues from faith to opacity. Quote, "What St. Augustine said of time, that it's perfectly familiar to each, but that none of us can explain it to the others, must be said of the world. This is the way things are, and nobody can do anything about it. It is at the same time true that the world is what we see, and that, nonetheless, we must learn to see it." Unquote. Thoreau would assent to this, I'm sure. Walden teaches us to see the world we see. The very item or items in which we have our faith are opaque, as is our seeing of it or them. But these opacities are neither to be ignored nor to be turned into grounds for skepticism. We are instead to trust, because we already do trust and cannot stop. This faith is common to the natural person and the philosopher. Nothing the philosopher does, from the moment she opens her eyes until the moment she closes them, no matter how compelling a skeptical conclusion seems to be, while it's held in place beneath its premises, ever dislodges this faith. In fact, the moment the philosopher attempts to move the skeptical conclusion from its sheltering premises, the conclusion is swept away in the onrushing current of this animal faith. That does not mean that the philosopher will acknowledge the fact. She may go on repeating her conclusion like a mantra, but she will hollow it out in all sorts of ways. But Thoreau doesn't try to turn this fact into a refutation of skepticism, but instead tries to draw our attention to how strangely a life is shaped when it's lived with this skepticism on its lips, but this perceptual faith in its heart. What becomes of such a life, so shaped? Do we want it? Why would we want it? What understanding of argument and its place in our lives could we have such that we can feel somehow logically necessitated in one direction and existentially necessitated in another? How can argument go so far as to insinuate itself between us and our living, our life? What is it to be in the predicament of being torn, so to speak, between a skeptical position and the upsurge of our own life and the life of the world, the upsurge of my animal faith? This can't be treated as a straightforward contradiction, hence the pointlessness of attempting to turn it into any familiar form of refutation. It is instead a murky existential self-stultification, a clash between our narrow rationality and our broad rational animality, between theoretical reason or a certain exercise of it and the demands of practical reason. Here's a helpful comparison. Kant, whose thinking about theory and practice is itself an advance over his contemporaries and over many of ours, took it to be the case that a person who denied the existence of God is guilty not of an absurdum logicum, a contradiction, but an absurdum practicum, of theoretically denying what is practically necessary, a condition of rational action. Showing that a person faces such a predicament is not a reductio, at least not as we standardly understand those, but it's rather a way of limiting the person's existential self-stultification. Such a person is existentially unstable. He hears the cry of perceptual faith, but then can manage at best a stammering kind of doing, because of the steady chant of skeptical conclusions that keeps distancing him from his perceptual faith. Now, I don't want to claim simply that Thoreau is advancing a Kantian absurdum practicum, but he's doing something akin to that. He's attempting to present our situation to us and asking us what to make of it, what we want to do about it, if anything. To be caught in an absurdum practicum of Thoreau's sort is not to hold a conjoint belief that's necessarily false. In fact, even the skeptical claim that I entertain when caught in this absurdum practicum cannot be called false exactly. It's also not exactly the case that I am exactly denying a condition of rational action. The problem is, in a sense, less the truth value of the claim or its connection to rational action than it is the person's standing in relationship to the claim, his or her standing as a claimant. He or she does not really believe the claim, but also does not deny it and does not really fail to believe it. Let's say he or she misbelieves it, where misbelief is a murky somewhat between belief and denial, disbelief. Misbelief is, as I've said, existentially unstable. Such a person denies his faith when in certain kinds of contexts, like in a certain classroom on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 1, but then lives it out all the rest of the time. Or such a person denies his faith when in serious moments of relationship with other human beings, but then resumes it when the mood lightens. Let me say again that being shown to be caught in such a predicament doesn't refute skepticism. It doesn't show that the skeptic contradicts himself. Thoreau wants us to wonder at and about ourselves. What are we doing? Why? Why do our lives teem with misbelief? Why so lukewarm? Why tossed so to and fro? Thoreau cannot compel us to be concerned about our existential integrity. We can always mouth or write certain words in our study and lose all contact with them while playing billiards. Such, I admit, is life. Such, I admit, is all too often my life. You can stand in philosophy where you can't stand in ordinary life. Thoreau can't stop you, and he can't show you to be irrational in so doing. Misbelief is not to be corrected by arguments if it's corrected. Its correction requires of us an approach no longer central in philosophy, although it remains present in certain outliers like Thoreau and Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein, and in the ancients, notably Plato. Call it a psychagogy. What we need is to repent, not to be refuted. Socrates describes it this way in the Republic. Quote, "When the beginning is what one doesn't know, and the end and what comes in between are woven out of what isn't known, what contrivance is there for ever turning such agreement into knowledge? When the eye of the soul is really buried in a barbaric bog, dialectic gently draws it forth and leads it above, using the arts we've described as assistants and helpers in the turning around. Out of habit, we called them kinds of knowledge several times, but they require another name, one that's brighter than opinion, but dimmer than knowledge." Unquote. Plato, as usual, meets us on his way back from where we'd like to go. Misbelief, that state of the soul when its eye is buried in a barbaric bog, requires a different kind of treatment than does false belief. Misbelief is a spiritual quandary, a slough of despond, as it were, much more than a philosophical error. The right way of taking this is not to say something like, oh, so this is a place, or one of those places, where our animality parts company with our rationality. What you're calling an absurdum practicum is a moment when my animal faith parts company with my rational theoretical skepticism, when animality takes one road and reason another. To twist folk reveal, animal and reason self-division's cause. But that's not the point I'm making, and it's not what I take Thoreau to believe. For there's nothing in us that's merely animal, although that does not make everything in us narrowly rational. It's a prejudice of philosophers to think that our rationality and animality can begin in different places, such that rationality could somehow get behind or beneath our animality, or our animality get behind or beneath our rationality. No. Neither begins nor ends in a different place than the other. We are incarnate rationality, fully rational and fully animal, in fleshed reason. We cannot think our animality without thinking it as rational, or vice versa. We see, for instance, not merely as an animal sees, but as a rational animal does. And this is part of what Merleau-Ponty is chasing across the opening pages of The Visible and the Invisible, when he points out that we see the world, things in themselves, and yet the seeing is ours. Only a rational animal can see the world in a seeing that it knows belongs to it. Only a rational animal can experience the world in an experiencing that it knows to belong to it. This mindness of my seeing and of my experience is not something that can be captured in any easy way. It's the opacity of seeing and experiencing. Attempts to capture it third personally, so to speak, turn the mindness into a spatial fact, but then the experience itself gets located as one of the spatial relata, and so no longer trues to the phenomenology of the experience. Attempts to capture it first personally fare better, but often not well. Such attempts turn the mindness of my experience into a mindness of the objects of my experience, and then the blind alleys of sense data or qualia beckon us to dead ends. How can experience be mine while none of its contents is mine in the relevant sense? How can my seeing be seeing of the things themselves and yet my seeing? The difficulty is keeping this fact in view without being forced into misbegotten strategies for explaining it or explaining it away. This is our perceptual faith and its opacity, and we have to live with both on pain of losing sight of the world and so of ourselves. The primary point I'm struggling to bring to the surface here is that Walden sees us steadily and whole as rational animals. Our rationality is, in the first instance, practical. That is what it is for there to be a thorough interpenetration of the rational and the animal. Perfecting ourselves as rational animals, and here Thoreau's thinking diverges from Aristotle's, however indebted it is otherwise, means understanding that theoretical reason is secondary to practical reason. Practical reason, or distortions of it, find expression in our lives themselves, in our living of them. The problem of other minds is a problem of practical reason and not of theoretical reason. That's the lesson that philosophers as different as Ralph Barton Perry, Wittgenstein, and Cavell have sought to bring to light, and that means that the problem is solved at last, if it is, by our actions in action. Now, this is a difficult and complicated business, and I don't want to represent myself as if I've thought it to the bottom. I surely have not, or suggest that I've found my way to full comfort with it or its consequences, consequences I take to be quite radical. Some of you will remember that there is a great passage near the close of Cavell's availability paper, The Availability of Wittgenstein's Later Philosophy, where he describes Wittgenstein's method in connection with Freud's. He talks about the methods as both deeply practical and negative. That's true of Thoreau's method, true of Walden too, but we have to hear negative in the right way, and that's true in Wittgenstein's case and in Freud's. Thoreau is working negatively against our lived skepticism, against a skepticism about ourselves and what we are that's inscribed into the very way we think about ourselves and into the very conception of the relationship between theory and practice that we have. By theorizing practice as we do, we lift our practical problems, the problems of life, from the only context in which they can be addressed, and we subtleize them in a way that, by freeing us from culpability, also prevents any actual solution of them. Only a practically rational animal can find its way into this predicament. Practical irrationality is open only to a practically rational animal. We need to take ourselves back from ourselves, to storm and overthrow our quietly desperate lives. We need to recognize how much we distort our lives in our theorizing of them, how completely we obscure our heart when we make it the thrall of theoretical reason instead of the organ of practical reason. As Thoreau says in Life Without Principle, there's no such thing as wisdom not applied to life. Reason is not a genus, such that theory and practice are two of its species, at least not in the way we normally think of genus and species. Even more importantly, practical reason is not, absolutely not, a species of theoretical reason, say theoretical reason plus application or some such. No, theoretical reason and practical reason are both determinants of the determinable reason, and we have no grasp on reason apart from our grasp on its determinants. And the distinction between the two is not itself really theorizable in the sense that we might think it is on a different picture of the relationship. One of the perennial temptations of philosophy is the temptation to think that the distinction between theory and practice is itself a theoretical distinction, one we understand theoretically, not practically. I want to go so far as to say that the distinction between the two is ultimately a distinction we have only a kind of practical access to, but I'm unsure how to explain that satisfactorily. I do tend to think that the distinction is one over which practice, not theory, has dispositive power. But again, I don't have much yet to say by way of explicating that. Now, I'm not advocating for a Humean picture on which reason is enslaved by the passions. Hume, I worry, cannot conceive of passions as anything but animal. He cannot see them as practically rational or as part of rational animality. There's no room on Hume's picture for practical reason as Thoreau presents it, reminds us of it. There's just theory and animality for Hume. Now, I know I'm oversimplifying, but my aim is not to score points against Hume, but to clarify the direction of Thoreau's thinking. Walden presents for our appreciation human beings as embodied practical reason made three-dimensional and locomotive, and it presents our lives to us as lived well or ill in the space of practical reason. So, final word. Thoreau writes to awaken us to lives we actually lead, and to ask us why we lead them, or whether we can be so much as said to lead them at all, rather than said to be drugged to and fro by them, or just to be drugged by them. We mistake somnambulance for wakeful walking. Shadows, night, nothingness encroach us from every side. Of course they do, but rejecting them is finally to live in a certain way, not to offer some proof of the nothingness of nothingness. The overarching faith to which Thoreau calls us in Walden is not rightly understood as belief without evidence or a willful ignorance of the dark. It's a way of living, of actively refusing the dark, a refusal that involves acknowledgement of the dark. As Kersop Lake once put it, quote, "After all, faith is not belief in spite of evidence, but life in scorn of consequence, a courageous trust in the great purposes of all things, and pressing forward to finish the work which is in sight, whatever the price may be," unquote. Walden is the great work of anti-nihilism in the history of philosophy. Thoreau says no to all of nothing. He sets his case on something, quote, "not a nihilometer, but a realometer," unquote. Why is there something rather than nothing? Hell if I know. But there is. Let's make the best of it. Here I am. And here's Thoreau with the last word for now, although there is no last word, not really. Quote, "I am simply what I am, or I begin to be that. I live in the present. I only remember the past and anticipate the future. I love to live. I love reform better than its modes. There's no history of how bad became better. I believe something, and there's nothing else but that. I know that I am. I know that another is who knows more than I, who takes an interest in me, whose creature and yet whose kindred in one sense I am. I know that the enterprise is worthy. I know that things work well. I have heard no bad news," unquote.
Wow. Well, now we have some time for questions. Yeah, okay.
Is it? Oh, okay. I'm not sure I have a question, but let's see. I was interested in that distinction that you made of two ways of thinking about rationality, practical versus theoretical. Not as a species, or not as two species of a genus, but determinants of a determinable. It's the first time I hear that distinction. I would like to, but perhaps just to complement, is it your point when I think I understand the view of rationality as a way of being embodied in Merleau-Ponty and maybe McDowell's position too. You didn't quote him, but I suppose it's a way of thinking about it. Are you suggesting that both theoretical and practical rationality are ways of what? I would say something like being in the world, something Heideggerian in that sense. And is that what you mean by saying that it is a distinction that we apprehend practically and not theoretically? That's also something that...
Yeah, well, and that's part of the paper, by the way, that I was talking about when I started. part of the paper about which I am the least sure, because as I say, even in the body of the paper, I'm not entirely clear how far I can go to elucidate the things that I've said there. I mean, what I'm thinking about, just to give you a kind of abstract kind of schema for thinking about this, is something like the way that the branches of the U.S. government are divvied out in the Constitution, right? So you've got the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. And what's interesting about that, right, that trichotomy, is that the judicial branch is the one that has sort of dispositive power over the distinctions. It's the one that decides what the powers of the others are when they've gone too far, and so on. So you've got one of the things that's distinguished in the distinction that has a kind of power over the distinction. And that's the sort of abstract structure I'm kind of toying with in the last part of the paper, or at least trying to get into view. I mean, there's more to it than just that. But like I said, that's sort of the schema. So the idea is to say, look, I think that when we do philosophy, it's incredibly easy to fall into this idea that the distinction between theory and practice is one such that the boundary between theory and practice is, as it were, policed by theory. You know, it's theory that tells us when we're leaving theory and beginning to practice or whatever. And what I want to say is, well, maybe it could go the other way. But that's unfortunately most of what I have to say, because I don't have a long story about how that would work. I mean, some of the things I try to say earlier in the paper are meant to suggest how this might go when talking about how Thoreau handles the practical problems of life and so on. But still, I really don't have a lot to say there. And so what I'm trying to do as much as anything in those final few paragraphs, and in far too much of a hurry, as everything in the paper was, right, is just trying to get a different way of looking at this sort of on the table, even if we don't know exactly where to go with it, so that we can start trying to think about what might be promising about this, if anything is, or maybe we just end up rejecting it as at the end of the day unintelligible. I mean, because I'm not convinced that I know what I'm talking about there. I mean, obviously, if I don't have very much to say, I've got to worry about how intelligible it all really is. So what I'm trying to do is to push back against certain standard models of that distinction. And one reason why I use that language, the sort of Anton Ford language about determinates and determinables, what I'm talking about there is what Ford in that wonderful paper of his calls categorical generality. You know this paper? At any rate, what I'm thinking about is the idea that if you have this sort of distinction where what you've got is two determinants of a determinable, the determinants have a kind of metaphysical priority over the determinable, right? So that, your grasp on red is really your grasp on the specific shades of red, right? And the idea is that something like that might be true of theory and practice too. And again, part of the reason I'm pushing on that is because I think it's not only the case that in philosophy we constantly think that the theory-practice distinction is policed by theory, but I think we also tend to want to assimilate, right, the practical to the theoretical. And of course, if we do that, that makes the policing fall out as a matter of kind of triviality, right? Because it's all really theoretical. It's just that what we call practical reason is just theoretical reason aimed at certain different objects than what we call theoretical reason is aimed at, right? And so I'm trying to push back in two ways against the standard handling of that distinction. But like I said, what it really means to say that practice could police that distinction, exactly how that would work, the way I want it to go, I don't have a ton to say about that, other than to say it seems to me worth thinking about, and it seems to me that this may be, in fact, something of the sort that Thoreau is concerned about, that when Thoreau talks about philosophy being honorable to profess because it was once honorable to practice, that he really is himself problematizing that sort of relationship in a way that we don't often recognize, and asking us, calling us to a kind of sobriety about it. What are we doing when we're doing philosophy? Why have we fallen into this kind of comfortable profession of things, having left off with the practice? And what I'm trying to do, as I said, is just try to find some way of thinking about that and seeing it as perhaps even more disturbing and unsettling than it looks to be on the page the first time you see it. But like I said, I know that doesn't tell you a lot about this, and I as I said, I don't have a lot to say about how this goes. I can, talk a little bit about certain kinds of cases, but at the general level, all I can do is say, yeah, I'm trying to push this sort of model, and this is something that I'm starting to think about in a variety of different contexts in philosophy in my own work, and thinking about Frege and thinking about various other philosophers, how this reorientation of this problem might be understood and how it might shed light on certain things. Because I think it's related to things like the concept-object problem in Frege and so on. But that's a whole different discussion, obviously.
Só lembrando que as perguntas podem ser feitas em português, né? A gente pode traduzir para o Kelly também. Ok? Well, I have a point. In this book of Cavell, there is a lot of ways to put some Kantian concepts in the words of Thoreau, and for me this is a huge mistake. And when I saw your sentence, like Thoreau's understanding of experience is radically non-reductive, he imposes no a priori constraints on what is and what is not available to experience. Well, this is actually the negation of Kantian project. Yeah. Well, and I would like to hear something about this non-Kantian view of the experience in Thoreau's.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is most attractive about Thoreau is what I say in that particular sentence, what you're calling the sort of non-Kantian view. I mean, there's a lot of things that Cavell says in the book by way of using Kant to elucidate Thoreau that it would take a long time to think through, obviously. But I do think that the right way of reading Thoreau is to say, yeah, he doesn't think there's any kind of a priori constraint on what can be an object of experience. Now, when I think about that idea, I'll admit it's not Kant who comes to mind first for me, but is, other sorts of 20th century philosophers who thought that there were, certain kinds of limits on what could be available to experience. But I do think that, let me put it this way, I do think that Thoreau, as I read him, for instance, believes that necessities, for instance, can be experienced. So that's, another deeply Kantian, non-Kantian sort of idea. In fact, I read Thoreau very much through the lens of, in fact, the paper, if you know, sorry, his name's escaping me here, Henry Bugby's work, right? If you know Bugby's work, then I've coded his work into this essay in various ways for those who know his work. And one of the papers of his that's had the most impact on my thinking, and you'll recognize how I echo it in certain places, is a paper called The Moment of Obligation and Experience. And, this is one of the things that he thinks is right. There is this moment of obligation and experience. Obligation can be revealed to you experientially. It's not something that, you can deny, that you need to deny experiential access to. And that's something I'm certainly on board with. I certainly think that's Thoreau's view. And, insofar as that's a view you can't rehouse in Kant, then, that just means that Thoreau can't be traveling with Kant at that point. I just think that he doesn't think that. He's not going to be interested in defending the kind of view that, Kant's interested in defending about what's available, in that sense, what's available to experience. So I think, obligation, value, all those things are for him available to experience. Now, again, available to experience has to be elucidated, because I think that it for instance, requires the cultivation of perceptual dispositions of certain kinds, right? I'm not saying that everything that's available to be experienced is just there to be experienced by anyone at any time in any old way, right? That's not the case. In fact, that's sort of why the paper moves in the way this paper moves in the order it does, because I want to say what I say about experience there at the end, having already said what I've said about, the eternal and the temporal, the individual and the universal, because I think that, being able to alter your mode of immersion in things is itself a disposition you have to cultivate. It's not something that's just available to you, as it were, just automatically. It's something that, comes across time with a certain kind of cultivation. And I think, as I say, I think Thoreau thinks we should cultivate it. But I think, once you've cultivated it, then those things are just there to be seen with your animal eyes. They don't require anything but those animal eyes. Yeah.
Well, we have time for our last question.
Kant does think that we can experience value as in the fact of reason. So, it's a different kind of experience, obviously, and it doesn't fall under the phenomenal realm. But he does think so, and I'll talk tomorrow a little bit about what I've got in mind. I sort of agree with both of you on the distinction between Thoreau and Kant, but I also think that there's a way in which something like what the Coulabart says at the beginning of the literary absolute, which is that the whole of the 19th century is determined, in a sense, by this matrix of Kant. So that everything is kind of in relationship to Kant, even though it's almost entirely, on the part of everybody, rejection.
Yeah, my teacher, Louis White Beck, the Kant scholar, used to like to say, you can philosophize with Kant or against him, but not without him. Right, so you're going to have to have something to say about all of that before it's over.
Well, thank you, Professor. It was very illuminating talk. Bom, temos um breve intervalo. Retornamos às 7h30. Okay.